Good afternoon. My name is Barron-DiCamillo. I am the former director of US CERT, and now I'm 3 months later. I'm actually, I'm at Strategic Cyber Ventures. I'm the Chief Technology Officer there. And today I'm here to talk about some of the things I saw from an operational perspective, specifically cases that involved clouds. We don't do a lot of naming and shaming when I was at US CERT, so I'm going to use a public example. How many of you have heard of codespaces.com? A couple of you have heard of that case? Okay, so apologies for some of you that know the details about it, but I thought it was a great case. It actually happened 2 years ago this month. And a lot of the lessons learned from what happened to CodeSpaces I think are still really relevant today. Let me move forward on this. Too many things to hold. I think they're still really relevant today. I think it really highlights the fact that there's a lot of organizations that are specifically moving their entire infrastructure into the cloud, and they're not doing the due diligence associated with that kind of a move. And so I wanted to walk through the case, and then we'll talk about some of the lessons learned from it. I think one of the things I've seen, working at US CERT and now and the things that I'm doing at Strategic Cyber Ventures is that cloud services is just another data center. And so the same kind of authentications, the same kind of protection mechanisms that you need for your environment, if it was a physical location within your enterprise, are going to be needed in the cloud. But a lot of times there's an inattention that's paid towards this extra complexity of moving your infrastructure to the cloud. And so over a 12-hour period, about 2 years ago today, it resulted in the collapse of one business called codespaces.com. Basically, CodeSpaces ran hosting services, they ran complete IT infrastructure, and they were a code hosting and project management service provider. They ran all their infrastructure in the cloud. They said that they performed real-time backups, as well as they had multiple offsites where they also backed up their data. The company also claimed that they had full recovery plan and that the plan had been tested and proven to work. So again, I think a lot of times we put together incident response plans and we go through the process of exercising those. We go through the process of looking at a redundancy, but a lot of times the exercise doesn't prove to be all effective in a real-world scenario, as is the case with what happened with CodeSpaces. So June 2014, the day started off with a denial of service attack. This is not a major crisis for them. They had dealt with this kind of thing in the past. The attacker had left a ransom note associated with this. They started investigating the attack, and they did find that login credentials had been compromised to their Amazon Cloud Management Console. It never was exactly clear how those credentials were obtained, most likely a phishing attack, but that wasn't ever specifically disclosed. But as is the case in a lot of environments, phishing attacks are very successful, as was demonstrated by the previous discussion. So CodeSpaces kept their customers abreast of this investigation. They continued to investigate the intrusion. They confirmed this information with their customers, and the attackers also saw this action happening in real time as well. The attackers had created several additional credentials within the environment. So when the CodeSpace engineers were going in and reestablishing these credentials, the attackers saw that action happening in real time. And obviously, they were a little upset at having their credentials cut off from what they had done, and that their ransom was being ignored. The ransom request was being ignored. So the intruders used these additional accounts and responded to the CodeSpaces closure of the original login by basically using the management console, and they started deleting all of CodeSpaces cloud services. Pretty soon, the engineers regained access to the console, but they had basically seen that the attacker had permanently deleted everything in the cloud, leaving a pretty nasty message to the company, next time pay the ransom. This moved from an instant response to an existential crisis. It became abundantly clear that codespaces.com, that all the customer data was lost, and that there wasn't backups available. Machine configurations were lost because they had all been deleted. They were all stored in one central location. The company assessed their current and long-term position and concluded that recovery was hopeless. They basically looked through, they published a final message within this 12-hour period of this attack. The cost and the loss, both reputation as well as the company, they were ceasing to provide services, and they closed their doors. A number of customers were informed additionally that all of their data was also lost through this. It was permanently lost through the compromise. So CodeSpaces, this incident serves some key risks when using a cloud. The most important one is to remember that the cloud is a high threat environment. It is in the internet. I think that's something that a lot of times enterprises aren't considering. They're putting the risk, they're moving the risk decision onto the cloud service provider, and they're not looking at the fact that this is an internet-connected entity. And we're seeing a number of cloud infrastructures that are managed through remote access. These management consoles are being used through username and passwords. Obviously, those can be compromised, as was also discussed in the previous presentation. I think some of the important lessons from the code space example is that infrastructure that's managed in the internet, you shouldn't allow administrative accesses without using some kind of a specific remote console. You should limit authentication to management terminals, and you should not just be using username and passwords for your privileged users. It provides no protection against stolen credentials, which was the case here. They didn't leverage two-factor authentication. A security token or even some kind of mobile verification code, it would have defeated the attack. These are well-known risks. But they're part of routine, and they should be part of a routine audit that we do as part of our businesses, but it was something that was not taken into consideration with code spaces. Sad to say, that's 2 years ago, but I think we're still seeing these kinds of lack of details when companies and enterprises are moving to the cloud. I know we've seen it in the cases that I worked when I was at US CERT. So with the bad news, I thought we'd kind of look at some of the increased focus on the cloud. Another thing that we're seeing from a cyber operational perspective is that there's, in the example of the code spaces example, there's outright destruction of data as well as services that's often being perceived by users as being backed up or secured by their cloud service provider. I think we as individuals have to ensure that we're reading the contracts associated with our cloud service providers and that we're understanding our own responsibilities. I think we continue to see enterprises that are pushing that responsibility onto cloud service provider, and they're assuming that this data is being backed up. And as is the case in the example I gave, that's not always valid. And we're also seeing an introduction of adversaries using these same cloud services for command and control as well as data exfiltration in order to blend in with the noise of the modern internet-connected devices. So I think cloud is obviously going to be an increased focus of adversaries, and I think as enterprise users, cloud service users, we've got to be just as much aware of the data and how it's protected in the cloud as we would if it was in our physical data center in our own building. So I looked at the CSA's top 20 threats for cloud computing, and the interesting takeaway from all of this, data breaches, being compromised, hacked interfaces, exploited system vulnerabilities, it all sounds so familiar because it's just another data center environment. I think we're seeing the ramifications of poor cloud computing decisions through managerial ranks are being affected just as much in the cloud as they would be in your data center if it was a physical location. So it's really the same security concerns that you have in your physical location for your data, you're going to have those in the cloud, and you need to make sure that you're taking those into consideration as you move your data and your infrastructure and your enterprise into the cloud. I think ultimately organizations are responsible for protecting their own risks in the cloud, and we have to ensure that we understand what those risks are and that we're not trying to transverse that risk onto cloud service providers. So basically, I'm just going to end on a note that, looking from a focus on vulnerability type, issues that are also being leveraged against the cloud, there is a race going on in the vulnerability management war, and I think we're still treading water. If you look at a lot of the reports that came out last year on vulnerabilities that are being leveraged against infrastructures, against cloud service providers, I think the most important things to emphasize are some of the common controls, some of the common sense things that we should be doing, which is patching these top vulnerabilities. And if a vulnerability ends up, or exploit for a vulnerability ends up in Metasploit, I would put that at the top of my list of something to ensure that I get patched. Ensuring that you have good vulnerability management systems in place, both for your infrastructure as well as for your cloud infrastructure, is something that we're also seeing not all organizations are taking that into consideration. They're ensuring that their endpoints are getting those patches, but they're not always taking into consideration their cloud instantiations. Patching quickly or you will suffer is a really important point to end on. This is a race of the vulnerability war that we're seeing, the defenders versus the adversaries, and I just want to remind us all to treat it as such. There's been a lot of improvement, but we need to continue to prioritize those patches, specifically ones that are being exploited in the wild and against our infrastructure in the cloud. And with that, I am done. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. There's like 9 of them. I only went over a few because they just seem to be, to me, so colloquial, like data breaches. So data breach is the big one in clouds. You know, same threat as you have in traditional corporate networks. But due to this vast amount of data, it's a high target for adversaries to go after, because not only can they get your data, but they can get everybody else's if they can possibly leverage the compromise the credentials of the cloud service providers. And so I think we're seeing an increased data breaches that are occurring with clouds. Anthem's a perfect example. 80 million records were lost. That one has to do with another threat, which is credentials being compromised. User credentials were compromised in that case, which resulted in 80 million records being expelled and lost and compromised because of that example, or because of that threat. But it's everything from data breaches to vulnerabilities to APIs, even seeing a lot of instantiations of users putting the hardened credentials associated with their code into things like GitHub, and then adversaries are finding that as well. So I think we have to be really smart of where we're putting our data and how we're, what kind of information we're putting into it, specifically when we're putting it into these open source instantiations like that. But that one was another trending thing that's happening as well. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.